Hello, I'm Colin Lynch, the UN-based reporter for Devex News, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Joanne Liu, a pediatric emergency physician at McGill University in Montreal. She has served around the world with Doctors Without Borders, often in the field, but also 6 years as the international president of the health organization. She also serves as a member of the World Health Organization's independent panel on pandemic preparedness and has been honored with the French Legion of Honor, among other awards. Liu is campaigning for the job of leading the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, competing with candidates from around the world, including from Ghana, Germany, Iraq, Switzerland, and Sweden. So why don't we get started, Dr. Liu? It's no secret that the UN Refugee Agency is facing some hard times. Budget cuts from the US and other donors have resulted in some 5,000 layoffs in 2025. Filippo Grandi, the current High Commissioner for Refugees, recently said the agency is in a $300 million hole, and this is in a year where UNHCR has already seen its overall budget shrink by as much as $1.3 billion. There is rising anti-refugee sentiment across Europe and the United States. So what, if anything, can be done to get UNHCR out of that hole? And perhaps you can kind of lay out some of your key priorities if you do get the assignment.
Thank you very much. I think that the current situation in UNHCR is quite striking and dramatic to a certain extent because it has a cost. It has a cost on the livelihood and the lives of refugees and people in forced displacement. I think that one of the first thing, if I am the leader of this organization and I have led an organization before with a workforce of 65,000 people working in 70 different countries in conflict zone with MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. It's to really, I would say, to regroup the people who are there and then to recenter our, what I call, social mission, our objective to the core of what is UNHCR. It's about protection of people in forced displacement. And so there will be some, the top priority initially is a regroup, recenter our focus mandate on protection. What does it mean concretely? Protection, legal from protection, and as well real protection for in facts. I mean, in terms of protection for people in forced displacement.
Right. So what do you do? We're now facing a moment which feels somewhat existential for UNHCR in the sense that you see eroding international norms, you see real attacks on the basic core, basically objectives of the 1951 convention. I mean, what can you do to try and push back on that? Do you have much hope that you will be able to stabilize UNHCR and win the support of governments who are increasingly negative about many of the, of the obligations of UNHCR?
I think that it's hard times. It's hard time for people in forced displacement, and it's a hard time for people across the planet to a certain extent. And that's the reason there are pushback. So I think there is a real role and key role for the UNHCR to humanize the discourse on migrants and forced displaced people, including asylum seekers and refugees. It is key. And so that's one of the things that needs to happen. It needs to, I would say, we have to have no compromise, especially on refugees on reinstallment, because we talk about all the forced displacement people, but I think that the core mandate is about refugees. We need to, at least to make sure we deliver on that, we need to make sure that member states do not give up on this very specific, because they are the most vulnerable. They are the ones who have fled their country for their life. And so we have to make sure that this process of reinstallment of refugees is still happening and that people are living up to their promises as member states.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that we really noticed over the last several years is the constant sort of demonization of refugees and migrants, particularly on social media. That has fed into elections. and a difficult sort of political environment for refugees. And I'm just curious to see, let's say on the social media front, I mean, how do you counter that? I mean, I see it at the refugee agency, but really across the UN system that, this kind of unbridled attacks on a lot of the core mandate of the United Nations and of the refugee agency that the UN is having a very difficult time countering it. I mean, how do you kind of get that message out to the public so that they're not clamoring for their elected leaders to take a harder line on refugees or to basically erode some of the obligations that governments have?
Yes. So I think that it's a question of the words that we are using, and it's a question of humanizing the discourse. I think it's a story. I think that talking about people in forced displacement only in terms of figures and statistics is not reaching the public. I am talking about refugees and migrants in Canada on a regular basis. And I'm humanizing and telling story because once people hear a story, they just say, well, they are going through adversity, and so maybe even if I cannot have, I would say, a sustainable or a final solution for them, there's no necessity to basically portray people in forced displacement as a living threat. And this is what is necessary right now, is if as UNHCR people at any level, we don't push back on this, it's going to be difficult. On the other hand, I think we have to acknowledge that there are difficulty. I sit here in my country in Canada. The food bank has never been so visited over the last few years. We in Quebec, one child in 10 go to school with an empty stomach. So we have to acknowledge there's impoverishment for as well countries, that people are struggling, and we need to find solutions that are bringing, I would say, a solution for people in forced displacement, but as well as acknowledging what is happening locally to the hosting population.
Now, you will have to engage with governments that are not big supporters of UNHCR right now. The Trump administration is basically supporting refugee resettlement, mostly for white South Africans. It's cut it off for most others. It's dramatically cut back the numbers. The U.S. government is now reaching out to other Western governments and putting pressure on them to restrict immigration and that sort of thing. But the U.S. is still the largest financial donor to UNHCR, even after its massive cuts over the last year. And so, what can you do to engage the Americans to get them to, at least stop trying to kind of undermine support for refugees internationally? And do you have many contacts in the U.S. government? Have you spoken to them yet as you campaign for this position?
Yeah, thank you for the discussion on the American. So the American is of course key. On the other hand, I think we're going to need to come to the realization and the acceptation that to a certain extent, it's very unlikely that on the short term we're going to go back to the budget that we used to have in the past, and with the support that the U.S. was giving to the different agency of the UN. So I think that it is very important, and as the US has asked in the last ExCom to the High Commissioner, is how will you reorganize and refocus your energy and action with a different budget, with a decreased budget? And I think that is the exercise. We need to accept that this is it. I've run an organization that went into austerity and into a deficit. And this is what you do, is at one point you make decisions, you try to make them as human as possible, as transparent as possible, and as I would say, clear in terms of trade-off when you make those kind of decisions. So somehow we need to accept that the budget will not go back on the short term to what it was before. We need to continue to engage with states as the US, but as others, because there is a trend right now. If the US continue, the other country as well continue to do that. But the reality is dealing and working with a sustainable solution for people in forced displacement is part of what is the general security in the planet to a certain extent. So it is important that people acknowledge that it we need to appease the flow of people in forced displacement. We need to assist it, and we need to do it with an approach that is not flouting the human rights of those people. It needs to be done with dignity. It needs to be done with a right-based approach.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, 5,000 layoffs this year. The austerity kind of era is in full force. Do you anticipate that it's going to get worse, and that if you do get appointed to this position, do you anticipate that you would have to impose greater austerity measures as we move ahead?
I will hope with Viver that it will not happen, and then we're going to be able to stabilize the organization. That is a huge, huge, I would say, blow. And then we need to be able to stabilize the cut in terms of budget and in terms of personnel. So that would be a goal to stabilize the situation and try to really work on stream of income from member state, and then as well as many other candidates have said, and as many other organizations is doing right now, is to diversify the stream of income.
Right. Well, as I mentioned, a lot of attention has been focused on refugee policy and the U.S. cuts, but the Europeans have been pushing back on refugee rights for the better part of a decade. I think much of this is sort of a backlash against the sort of era of extreme generosity during the 2015 period, with large numbers of Syrian and Libyan refugees coming into Europe. Now it's very difficult to get elected if you do not have a tough stance on immigration. What is the message that you would bring to the Europeans? And do you see much opportunity for changing the narrative in Europe?
I think in Europe is going to be as well a challenge, but I think that people have been upholding to a certain extent to some basic principle. So I am a principled, pragmatic person in terms of that. And then we would need to find solution that is workable and human as much as possible. And I think it's the reality is when we look here in many countries, here in Canada, but in other countries, is people are trying to live up to some of their commitment, but they are trying as well to make sure that it's not decreasing a certain support from the general population. But the reality as well is the fact that people in general, the general public is concerned, is struggling, but as well still want to support. And then we have proof of that, because when there were the and there's still but when it started initially, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, it was very clear that people were ready to give a hand. And then we did all sort of gymnastics in terms of how to welcome the people who were fleeing the conflict. So it is not as if there is no there is no hope of making people to change their stance. I think as well, it's a question is how it reached them and how they feel as well their sense of responsibility towards a given conflict or a given situation.
There's been a lot of focus on the experience of Denmark, on the example of Denmark, which has taken sort of what they call the zero refugees policy, which is trying to make an effort to dramatically reduce the numbers, which they have succeeded in doing, but also imposing a number of rather controversial policies, including requiring that asylum seekers be sent to other countries to seek asylum. The British have kind of played around with the same idea, which was, I guess, reversed by British courts. But I'd be curious what you think about this model. I mean, I guess that, if you were to go to the Prime Minister of Denmark and sort of make the case for, a more generous approach, you might hear a response along the lines of, here we have a social democrat government, a fair, relatively progressive government, and this is the only way we can win elections. And if it's not, a very, disciplined refugee process, then we're going to end up with much more hostile governments. So how I'm curious what you think of Denmark's example.
Well, it's a striking example, but the reality is we're going to need as well to look at a more longer cycle of things in terms of demography. And then it is clear that somehow with the current fertility rate of some country in Europe, and then with the demographic of certain country in Europe, it is unlikely that you're going to keep an active workforce over the next few years. Most of the countries in the Northern Hemisphere over the next 5 to 10 years will have more than 25% of their population above 65 years old. So eventually, we're going to need to think about much more sustainable solution in terms of keeping an active workforce, and then including and calculating and projecting the hosting and the welcoming of immigrants will need to come into the calculation. So I think that is going to be a difficult conversation to come up with. And I'm not saying that everything's going to be easy. I think it's going to be a tough job. But I think it's a tough job that is worth it because we have the responsibility to support and then to give a future, especially for people who are refugees. So I think at the very, very least, as a goal is we need to make sure that we still deliver for refugees, and we need to see what can be shared in terms of responsibility for other group. But I think in terms of protection, it needs to remain. But after that, all the humanitarian, I would say, activities that UNHCR have taken upon itself over the last few years, maybe we're going to need to share the I would say the workload of those activities.
So sharing the workload is sort of at the core of the Global Compact for Refugees, right? The notion that too many countries that are in the neighborhood of conflict or of other crises are are shouldering too large of a burden, and that many other countries are not. So the U.S. has made it clear that it opposes the Compact on Refugees, describing it as reflecting a globalist approach to governance. And the Europeans are also sort of cutting back on the numbers at a time when the numbers are growing. And so is it your sense that the Global Compact for Refugees is essentially being utterly undermined, and that, do you see much hope that this notion of shared responsibility is going to become, something that, governments take seriously?
Well, the Global Compact has been something that has been discussed and led uh, with the participation of member states, and has been supported in Marrakesh, but more than 120 states, and I think we're up to 150. But the thing is it's a bit like the Human Rights Declaration. This is what we would like, and this is what would be in an ideal world. And then it's not because it's ideal that it's not happening, that people are not completely following through. But it is important to keep the Global Compact and then to keep talking about it, because the basic of it, of having a regular, safe, and orderly flow of migrants is key. Predictability will be key to address some of the issue that I was talking about, demography. So yes, it's like anything else. It's like any other, I would say, agreement. It has the lows and highs. We might be in a lower moment, but I think that people might come back with that because it gave a framework of how it should be, with some humanity, some responsibility, and some predictability. And these are pretty much key in terms of projecting ourselves in the future.
Right. Let me ask you about Libya. European governments have underwritten the cost of the Libyan Coast Guard to sort of interdict migrants, including refugees, and often on the basis of kind of UN, European sort of surveillance technology. The notion being if they are if they are taken aboard a Libyan vessel, they can come back to Libya, and if they're taken on board a European vessel, they would have to go to Europe where they could make their claims. So this has dramatically cut back the number of migrants moving into Europe, but it's also come at a fairly high humanitarian human rights cost, particularly for those who have been returned to detention centers in Libya, which have been where there have been reporting of widespread abuses. What's your kind of feeling about that arrangement to support the Libyan Coast Guard? Is that a pragmatic, practical way of addressing the crisis, or is there another better way to address these kind of issues?
I think that, and I've been involved in this part of the world. I visited those detention centers in 2016 and 2017. I have addressed the European Union about this. And unless, and I doubt that things have changed, detention center in Libya are what I call, and I've named, I would say, the cruelest incarnation of men's greediness and cruelty. So I think that we cannot let people in those kind of circumstances, any human being, these are places of abuses and repeated abuses. So we need to find a way to not let people be captive in those environments of repeated abuse. There's this is not possible, and that's very unfortunate because Médecins Sans Frontières had boats, and then we have stopped our activities in this region, unfortunately. But the cost, and people needs to be reminded because they hate to be reminded. The cost of what is happening is a human cost. It's human suffering. It's human suffering at industrial level. So other solution needs to be found out.
Right. So I mean, I've covered the UN for quite a while, and my sense is that when the Secretary General appoints, selects heads of specialized agencies, they're not just picking the individual, they're also picking the country. So the United States gets World Food Program, they get UNICEF, and there has been an informal practice of selecting Europeans for UNHCR. A lot of it goes back to the original history of UNHCR, which was initially focused on Europe, but now is global. And I'm curious to see what you think, I mean, whether you have any reason to believe that the Secretary General may be open to selecting someone like you who is outside of Europe. And also, I don't know whether has Canada nominated you for the post, or are you pursuing this on your own, and whether you think that would have a difference in terms of your prospects for being selected?
Well, I think that the reason why I put forward my candidacy is what I said at the beginning of our conversation, is I'm someone who has worked at the front line of crisis and I've worked with refugees. I think I'm one of the rare candidates who has done that and hands-on working with refugees for more than 30 years of my life. I have run refugee camp. I have worked as in charge of a country where we had huge refugees. And as the international president, I have worked with the crisis on migrants at different level and in different, I would say, stream of refugees from the Northern Triangle to the U.S. to the Balkan routes through the different arrival spot in Europe, in Italy and in Greece, and then I have followed through from Libya. So I have this first hand experience at different level. I have run an organization and I've know how to fundraise as well in terms of an organization um, from state, but as well from private sectors. Um, as you may know, the MSF is an organization that fundraises to the 2.5 billion euro on a yearly basis. So this is what I'm bringing to the plate. This is what I think would be useful in terms of the next High Commissioner, someone who understands what is the plight on people in forced displacement, but as well as management skills, in addition of having and negotiated with a head of state and with head of a UN agency. So, so of course, we know that there's always been some sort of arrangement in terms of head of agency, but I think we're mature and for a change, and having someone coming from a country where we're not a threat, we are paying our due to the UN regularly, and then we are still accepting refugees, and we believe in in and then we follow and support the Refugee Convention of 1951. I think that could be an asset, that could be a plus. So so this is what I can say at this stage, that yes, there is some habits, but it's not because there is some habits that we're going to change those habits. And I think that I'm a credible and then and a different type of candidate who could bring something interesting to the role of the High Commissioner.
Right. Have you already begun sort of reaching out to governments yet in terms of the campaign, or have you been interviewed yet by the Secretary General or his office that is kind of organizing the campaign?
Indeed, I did.
Yeah, you already did an interview with the UN. How did that go? Can you tell us how that went?
No, I think I've been talking with the High Commissioner. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. All right, good enough. Okay. Um, one other thing I was sort of curious about, and this goes back to some of the first questions I was asking, is that, we are in a moment where a lot of the sort of norms of UNHCR are kind of being challenged. And, do you think that we're facing right now a real existential threat to the future of UNHCR? Or do you think that this is something that in 5 years down the road, maybe we'll be in a much better spot than we're in now, and that, the mood of countries might change. I mean, you mentioned the need for European countries to address issues of dwindling population and the need for a workforce. Do you think that that narrative is likely to kind of gather strength in the coming years?
I think that narrative in terms of looking at how things are happening and people will realize it. I think yes, I'm 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 quite convinced that eventually it will get more traction. But I think we're going to go through a rough patch.
Yeah, I was noticed something in your resume that you're the chair of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and I imagine not a lot of people know what that is, but it's a very fascinating organization in Geneva that does a lot of kind of mediation behind the scenes, was very much involved in the Ukraine grain deal several years ago. And I'm curious whether you might bring a bit of mediation into the role of the High Commissioner for Refugees if you come into that spot.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So you mentioned Dialogue Center is an organization that's been existing for 25 years and has
Hmm.
been doing what we call the back channel negotiation for mediation and negotiation for peace. And so every year we negotiate from what I call the goat to the outer space. So it is an organization that bring deal quiet diplomacy. And this is what I have. I've been on the board now for 5 years, and I've been the chair for 1 year. And this is what I've learned: is quiet diplomacy works. Quiet diplomacy brings solution and can bring solution in a sustainable way. But sometimes it takes much longer than what we want, but it does work. And yes, I will bring that into the role.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Liu. It was really a pleasure chatting with you, and I appreciate your taking out the time. And good luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you.